So there are like more people here than I was expecting. And I say that because the topic was kind of obscure. Like when they kind of threw out to me the suggested topics, and I gave some of the organizers a few ideas of things that I wanted to speak about. Of course, I'm interested in the subject. I just didn't think that there would be this many people interested in the subject, which of course is a very welcoming thing. But the other thing that I'm very excited about is that I'm a teacher. I teach grade 7 social studies, and a whole bunch of people who I've taught over the years are here today. And some of them have beards, and they're big, and they're like grown men and women, and it's very strange, but it also makes me feel very old. I turned 37 yesterday, so this is like, it's a lot. Okay, so I will try to keep this talk as simple as possible, despite the fact that the name is a little bit misleading, because the talk is not just about the rise and fall of the Sharia courts, but the rise and fall of the Sharia in Ottoman Palestine in general. Now, when I say Ottoman Palestine, that's a caveat. That's something that I've put in there to save myself. The reality is that I'm speaking about the rise and fall of the Sharia and the Ottoman Empire in general. But because my specialization is in Ottoman Palestine, and because all of the sources that I've used focus on Ottoman Palestine, I put that there because there may be some things that were specific to Ottoman Palestine that didn't happen in the Balkans or Anatolia or somewhere else. But the reality is almost all of what I'm going to say today applies to the rest of the Ottoman world. So it's a caveat for the sake of intellectual honesty, but don't think about it as being super exclusive to Ottoman Palestine. Okay, so the first question that I will ask is, what is a caliphate? What was the Khilafah? And secondly, when did the caliphate collapse or dissolve? And this is a small enough room where I feel like I could ask questions and actually expect answers in return. So for those of you who are somewhat well read in their history, what was the Khilafah, first and foremost? The Khilafah is the Arabic word for caliphate. What was the caliphate? Yeah, go ahead.
It was a general ruler who can maintain the structure of the Islamic society during the period.
Okay, to maintain the structure of the Islamic society. Do you all agree with that definition? I don't disagree with it, by the way. So, good. Does that sound familiar to most of you, some of you? Anyone have an alternative definition? You want to give it? Yeah, go ahead.
Although it was focused on the Islamic society, it did encompass other societies as well.
Okay, so there is a very important thing that Abdul Aziz has said there, which is that the Muslim world was never, whether we are talking about Al-Andalus, whether we are talking about the Abbasid era, the Umayyad era, the Ottoman era, the Muslim world was never homogeneous. We never had exclusively Muslim society. You might have exclusively Muslim cities or towns or villages or something like that. But on the whole, you're talking about multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, multi-religious societies. Okay, so when did the caliphate dissolve then? The 3rd of March, 1924, right? We just commemorated, remembered, bemoaned the 100-year anniversary of the dissolution of the caliphate. Well, based on that definition and that date, here's my next question. Is the caliphate a caliphate if it does not rule by the Sharia? Okay. So if you have someone who calls himself Amir al-Mu'mineen, you have people today who call themselves Amir al-Mu'mineen, right? So if you have someone who calls themselves the Khalifa, Khalifatu Rasulullah, like you have someone who has the title and who wears the cloak of the caliph, but they don't rule by the Sharia, is that a caliphate? How many people say yes? Put your hands up. How many people say no? Oh, come on, be more committal than that, okay? How many people say yes? Put your hands up. How many people say no? Okay, so the no's take it. If your definition of the caliphate is contingent upon the application of the Sharia, then the date that you gave me is wrong. Because the Sharia was dissolved much earlier than the Caliphate. The Sharia and the application of the Sharia died much earlier than the Ottoman leadership that ruled the Caliphate died. We're talking 7 decades separating these. And this is the story that I want to tell. Unlike some of the other lectures that I suspect you heard throughout the week, I was not here for those lectures, but I saw the list of speakers and I have no doubt that they were spectacular. I will not actually focus on the fiqh, the jurisprudence, the application of Islamic law per se, or specific rulings and their subtleties. That's not what this is going to be about. I'm more interested in the way that the Sharia courts functioned on a daily basis, how normal they felt. I'm more interested in, for the sake of the audience and for intellectual curiosity, how the Sharia courts dealt with women and minorities and the courts as an expression of the Ottoman political philosophy as it relates to the administration over minorities. Okay, so that's going to be a really big part of today's talk. I want to focus on how did the Ottomans view, how did the Ottoman universe relate to the pluralistic reality that they lived in. Let me say this in the simplest way that I can. There was nothing weird to the Muslims of the previous generations that Christians and Jews and Druze and whoever, that all these people were their neighbors. That wasn't strange. There was nothing foreign about that. That was the world they kind of expected to live in. But certainly if you have that much diversity, one would expect that there was a kind of thought process in dealing with that diversity. And I'm going to spend a significant amount of time speaking about that. All right. So the first thing that I will say is this. The Ottoman Empire ruled at an arm's reach. Okay? And the era that I look at in particular is 1517 all the way to the collapse of the empire. So from 1517, when the Ottomans came to inherit the lands of the Mamluks, and took it by force, of course, from 1517 onward, the Ottomans really did not. I'll paint a picture for you. If you were a villager living in Palestine in the 16th, 17th, or 18th century, you probably never dealt with a Turkish-speaking Ottoman official in your life. You never saw one. To the extent that you dealt with the empire at all, it was through local proxies. It was through people that the Ottoman Empire appointed to rule on their behalf and to administer on their behalf. So if you have this vision of tarbush-wearing Turkish soldiers goose-stepping through Jerusalem or something like that, get it out of your head. That wasn't a thing. Yeah, occasionally you would have like Ottoman military governors come in to suppress a rebellion or something like that. And if they kind of liked the place that they were deployed to, then they might stay there for generations. And then they would eventually Arabize if they were in the Arab world, or Balkanize if they were in the Balkans, whatever it is. But on the whole, the Ottomans ruled through local administrators. Okay? This system could really be described as taxes in exchange for protection. Okay, now I'm going to slow down here for a moment. On what basis does the Canadian state derive its legitimacy? Why do we listen to the police? There, that's like the easy. Why do we pay our taxes? When Canada Revenue calls, like, you're all the children of people who hate paying taxes, right? Many of us are small business owners or come from families of small business owners, and we hate dealing with Canada Revenue. I come from a family where my mother, to this very day, hates speaking to the police. Like, doesn't like dealing with law enforcement at all. Why do we deal with law enforcement? Why do we deal with the state? Why, when I had to go get my passport renewed, did I bother even going through this process? By what authority does the Canadian state derive its legitimacy? Why do I go through these charades of getting a driver's license in the way that they want me to, and paying taxes in the way that they want me to, and voting in the way that they want me to? Where does the state get its legitimacy? Do you understand the question? I have like a lot of blank faces, right? How does the Canadian state impose its authority? Yes?
It has national defense.
Yes. The Canadian state derives its legitimacy, not just the Canadian state, every state derives its legitimacy through the imposition of violence. That's the foundational level of every state that basically exists in the world today. Everything that we call a modern state is ultimately rooted in the power of coercion. Okay? So we pay taxes because if we don't pay taxes, then the state will send us a piece of paper saying your taxes are late. And then if we don't respond to that piece of paper, they will send us another piece of paper saying you need to go to court because you are now committing a crime. And if we refuse to go to court, they will send men and women of violence to our homes and force us to go to court or force us to go to jail. And if we refuse, I want you to understand how deep this logic is. If when the state comes to collect taxes and I refuse, and not only do I refuse, but I respond with small arms fire and Qassam rockets or something like that, okay, the state will send the full force that it has because they would rather spend more money subduing me than philosophically submit to the point that this guy's allowed to not pay taxes. You understand? Like they will send Apache helicopters and SWAT teams to the extent that like the Canadian military has these things. But anyways, they will send like the full force that they have at their disposal to stop me from saying I'm going to evade taxes. And that is where the state derives its legitimacy. The Ottoman Empire did not possess the ability to impose its will in that fashion in Palestine, in Greater Syria, in the frontier regions of Transjordan. The Ottoman Empire did not possess that. Not only did the Ottoman Empire not possess that, no empire did. That's a very modern thing that I'm talking about. So where did the Ottoman Empire derive its legitimacy? From the protection and the delivery of religious services. That's a very fancy way of me saying that another condition of being a khilafah, of being a caliphate, is can you administer and protect the Hajj? That was more important to the legitimacy of the Ottoman Caliphate than collecting taxes. You cannot call yourself Amir al-Mu'mineen if you cannot keep the Hujjaj safe. Anyone have any questions about this? Again, it's a small enough room where I don't mind if we do that. No? No? Okay. So how were services delivered then? Because surely the Ottomans delivered some services, and they kind of did, although most of the services were delivered by local actors in the name of the Ottomans. And those services came in the form of awqaf, or awqaf is a plural of the Arabic word waqf. And a waqf is a trust, but that doesn't help at all. So I define it like this. A waqf is the delivery of public services as an act of worship. Who builds roads in the city of Burnaby? Who's responsible for building roads? It's actually like a cross between the city and the province, but okay. SkyTrain's provincial administration, right? Sewage, to a large extent, municipal, sometimes it's developers. In any case, we kind of break things down into municipal, provincial, and federal spheres of administration, right? Well, it would have been very normal in the Ottoman world for a private individual to say, there needs to be a road from here to here. I am going to sponsor this road. Not just sponsor it, I'm going to pay for it. And this is a waqf. This is something that I have established for the sake of Allah, and people will get to use it forever. Okay? I'm going to build a school or a hospital or whatever it was, most of the products and services that were publicly available to people in the Ottoman world were available through awqaf. Even the things that were built by the Ottomans were awqaf of the Sultan. They were considered things that the Sultan had paid for out of his, essentially his own personal wealth, but his personal wealth was the wealth of the state. Okay, there are other really important functions of the awqaf that, just before I go on, how many of you are familiar with the definition of waqf that I have shared with you now? That sounds like something you've heard of before. Hands up. Okay. I'm willing to bet that when I speak about awqaf later, I'm going to introduce something to you in awqaf that you probably haven't heard of. Because it turns out the type of waqf that I just described, despite how numerous they were, actually made up a small fraction of the overall awqaf. All right. The Sharia courts themselves were also awqaf. Sometimes the Sharia courts were just sponsored by wealthy families. Some local family would say, we need a court here. Sometimes it would be a waqf that was sponsored by the Ottoman state or by some Ottoman governor or something like that. And they weren't really self-sustaining from tax revenue so much as they were self-sustaining from the fees that they collected to deliver their services. Now, what I really want to focus on here, because I find it a point of particular interest, is that the Sharia courts were a family business in Palestine. The Husseinis and the Khalidis, the Dajanis, the Jarallas, they had generation after generation after generation after generation administering the Sharia courts. So it would go down from father to son, from father to son, from father to son. And there would be a Hanafi Qadi and a Shafi'i Qadi and a Hanbali Qadi. And I never read actually of a Maliki judge in Palestine, which is interesting. I'm not saying that they didn't exist. I just haven't stumbled along it. In Nablus, you had the Tuqan family and the Nimirs and the Abdul Hadis, the Shuqairis in Akka, Al-Madis in Haifa, another Husseini family in Gaza. But the point is, it all followed this mode, that these were effectively hereditary positions. And they were quite lucrative. Being the chief judge of the court of Jerusalem would have been like being a Supreme Court judge. It was a good position to have financially, and it was a good position to have socially. So when we speak about Sharia courts, to some of the Muslims in the audience, and certainly to any of the non-Muslims in the audience, unfortunately, the assumption is that the Sharia courts were this exotic place where people went to go get dumped into boiling pits or something like that. The vast, vast, vast majority of what the Sharia courts dealt with were things that by any standard would be quite mundane and boring. And the reason why that's important to mention is because to the people who lived in those times, the Sharia courts were normal. It was just life. And they were using these courts all the time. And I have personally read of instances where the Sharia courts were administrating law in disputes between two Christians. Now, this is despite the fact that the Christians had access to their own courts. This was part of the Ottoman legal administrative system, I will speak about this later, where the Christians and the Jews and other communities didn't need to rely on the Sharia courts. They could create their own court system according to their own legal traditions, and they didn't need to use the Sharia courts. So we could talk later about why they decided to use the Sharia courts, but the main thing that the Ottoman courts were used for were two things. Number one, the administration, the maintenance, the management of awqaf, and number two were disputes of inheritance. Okay. I spoke briefly about a waqf being the delivery of public service as an act of worship. The vast majority of awqaf were not that. Between 1517 and the 1850s, there wasn't much in the way of private property law in the Ottoman Empire. Most people lived on communally held land. And most people who owned buildings built those buildings for a particular purpose, but it wasn't zoned the way that modern, I know this is getting, like, I have at least one person here who deals with like municipal administrative management who's probably enjoying this, but for the rest of you are thinking like, why is he talking about this so much? It ends up being really important. For the vast majority of people, they weren't zoning land the way that they do now. So if you built a home, or if you built a flour mill, if you built a wood shop, if you built a bakery or something like that, and you were afraid that somewhere down the line someone was going to usurp this from your children, here's what you would do. Here's what they did in Ottoman Palestine. You would create a waqf for that building, and the waqf would read like this. This building is the property of my family until the biological termination of our family. And after the biological termination of our family, this building will be given fi sabilillah. Okay? So what that means is you've created a waqf for generations down the line, but not today. Today it is not a waqf. Today it really just operates as like a private business or a private residence. Okay? But it gives you a piece of paper that says you inhabit that building or you operate that business. And the Sharia courts were super busy either administrating and issuing these waqf documents or debating and contesting them when people were in fact trying to take buildings from their cousins or their brothers or whoever or their neighbors, just like the way that people do now. Which brings us to the other most commonly used purpose of the Sharia courts, inheritance. People were disputing over inheritance all the time. So why would they use the Sharia courts? Like, what was the main drive to use them? Because just a heads up, the use of the Sharia courts was not mandatory. If you have a problem now, you have to go to court. You didn't have to go to these Sharia courts, but people chose to. Why do you think they chose to go? Why do you think two Palestinians from Nablus or Gaza or something chose to go to the Sharia court rather than not? Because I'm willing to bet that the vast majority of you, if you didn't have to deal with ICBC, you wouldn't. So why? Why do they go to these courts all the time?
Fairness. Maybe the alternative is that families get involved and it becomes like a tribal thing.
Spot on. You're from Dar'a, right? Yeah. So he knows this. Because the alternative is that these families will kill each other. Right? And this is not an exaggeration. You're talking about a time where almost everyone was armed. Right? And if we're getting into after the 18th century, Palestine experienced a kind of financial boom. Bedouins and peasants were using a lot of their increased revenues to buy European-made weapons, and Palestine was awash with guns. Right? So suddenly, using the Sharia courts, even if it doesn't rule in your favor, is certainly better than the alternative, which is annihilating each other. So what about the imposition of social norms? Because again, I think the vast majority of people imagined that the Sharia courts were, again, more exotic than the picture that I'm painting for you. I think most people imagine that the Sharia courts were busy dragging in like young girls, and somebody says, she was not wearing a hijab! And then everyone goes, kill her! And it's just this like, But this is not what never happened. There is no documented case like this, and here's why. Because the imposition of social norms tended to be something that was applied on the family level. So, all people functioned, whether they were urban Palestinians or rural Palestinians, that is peasant Palestinians, or Bedouin Palestinians, they belonged to either Hammules, which is like a family of families, or big notable families, big urban families, or tribes. And in a tribal society, your reputation is as important as currency. Every single Muslim in this room who comes from like Muslim majority countries still have legacies of this, right? Where when the time that you will, I imagine because the room is full of undergrads, that most of you are not married yet, but when you are going to get married, you discover that the reputation of your family is still a very important thing. And this was an even bigger deal back in the time period that I'm speaking about, because it didn't just relate to marriage. If the reputation of your family was trash, you could not borrow money, you could not trade in confidence and in trust. No one will do business with you, and no one will marry you, and no one will come to your defense if your family or your clan or your tribe needs help. Now, of course, your reputation would have to be really terrible to get to that point, but the point that I'm making is that families, for better or for worse, would have been the place where people constrained social norms, where people would have expected values to be rigorously applied. It wouldn't take much to offend someone in a way that could spiral out of control very quickly. And just for what it's worth, like I don't know how many Arabic speakers I have in the audience, but Arabs are spectacular at taking your worst quality and turning it into your nickname. So like, if you open a business and it fails, like you're Palestinian or Jordanian or something, and you open you worked hard, you got investors, you started a business and it failed, they'll be like, هذا محمد الفاشل. Like, oh, this is Muhammad the failure. And that just becomes your name for the rest of your life. Right? So imagine that, but on a much larger scale. All right. So I'm actually going to go over that, skip over this. So now I want to get to the subject of how the Sharia courts dealt with women in particular. And to the Muslims and the non-Muslims in the audience, I don't dabble in fantasies. Despite the fact that I like fantasy fiction, I like my history to be honest. And I think the most interesting stories are the ones that are real. And so with that said, if we look at the legacy of the Sharia courts and the way that women fared in the Sharia courts, there's a very interesting story when you contrast two cities, Tripoli in Lebanon, not Libya, the Lebanese Tripoli, and Nablus. And it turns out that on average, women in the courts of Tripoli and people who were advocating on behalf of women in the courts of Tripoli. So what I mean by that is that maybe there's a mother who's trying to inherit land, but the person who's in the court is actually her son. Or there's a son trying to inherit from his deceased mother versus someone who's trying to inherit from an uncle. Okay, so in court cases relating to women, it turns out the women of Tripoli fared much better than the women of Nablus. Now, is that because Nablus was a chauvinistic, backward mountain region, and Tripoli was this super advanced, super liberal, super progressive? This is all nonsense, of course. Neither of these things are true. Here is what we discover when we look at this in more detail, and if you're curious about the historian who has done work on this, his name is Bishara Dumani, a fantastic historian. Not the most exciting book, because it deals with pretty dry subject matter, but the conclusions are very interesting. So, the first thing that he notes is this. In Nablus, the judges tended to be from Nablus. So, the big families of Nablus were the Tuqans, the Nimirs, the Abdul Hadis, the Al-Qasims, the Jarrars. The Jarrars were a peasant family. But anyways, those are the big families of Nablus. And the judges were also Tuqans and Nimirs and Abdul Hadis. Okay, they were from these families, which means they were also invested in the outcome, and it means that they were going to have to live with the consequence of their rulings, okay, on a very personal level. The other thing that we discover is that in Tripoli, the stakes were much lower. Most of the time, disputes were over a bustan, which translates roughly into like a garden. So in terms of the acreage of the land that is being disputed over, it was much smaller. Whereas in Nablus, disputes were usually over something that was described as a bayyara, which is like an orchard, which is big. So the stakes were higher. The judges were personally and familially invested. And the other thing is, the women of Nablus tended to live, well, the families of Nablus tended to live in big compounds with their family members. Whereas the families of Tripoli tended to live in private homes. All of these things, Bishara Dumani says, led to a situation where, as a general rule, not just women, but the weak in general tended to fare worse in Nablus than in Tripoli. Now, why did I bother sharing this? Because we should not let our romantic imagination of the application of the Sharia and our nostalgia for this time period cloud our real assessment of what life was like. If I want you to leave with any understanding today, it's that the Sharia courts were normal. They were a normal part of people's lives. And if they were normal, then you need to understand that there was also dhulm, there was also oppression. You need to understand that there were also con artists. You need to understand that there were also forgeries. You need to understand that all of these things happened. And there were people who manipulated situations for their self-interest. But the reality of the story, at least as far as I'm concerned, is what makes it beautiful. It's what makes it real. All right. Well, if that is the application of the Sharia, and if it was so normal and so mundane, why did it collapse? And why did it collapse decades before the Ottoman Empire actually collapsed? And so now I will introduce you to the dichotomy that describes the differences in philosophy of how to deal with minorities in the West and in the Ottoman world. And it can really be broken down into two broad concepts: equality versus tolerance. So far as, well, actually, I'll get there in a bit. As nation states came to take the place of empires, these new nation states, these new polities, they were like new operating systems that were running old apps. And they had applications like Christian theology, Darwinism, Enlightenment philosophy. They had capitalist economics. And an emergent property from these apps is the principle of equality, that all men are created equal. So why does this emerge in the era of the nation state? British Columbia is a big province, right? Okay. So in order to build the SkyTrain line that is being built in Fleetwood in Surrey right now. How many people here are from Surrey? Right. Yes. Join me to the shanty town when we return home. In order to build the SkyTrain line in Surrey, we collect taxes from people in Vancouver, right? We take all the money from those yuppies and we build SkyTrains in the Fraser Valley. And that's how every nation state works. We take money from wealthy regions and build massive infrastructure projects in regions that could not afford them. Yes? Okay, do any of you have a problem with the idea of money being taken from taxpayers in Surrey to pay for services in Canal? When there's a big forest fire, what do we send to put out the forest fire? We send first responders, right? We send firefighters. Who do you think pays for that? Do you think the people of Kitimat and the people of Canal and the people of Prince George, do you think they pay for that? Have you ever been to those towns? They don't have the money to pay for these things. We pay for it. Do any of you have a problem with that? I presume not. But would you have a problem with it? And I want you to really think about this. Why do you not have a problem with it? Why do you not have a problem with us paying to put out fires in Kitimat? Yeah?
Because they're in need.
Because they are in need? Perfect. How about if there was a forest fire in Seattle? Not our jurisdiction. Not my monkeys, not my circus, right? This is somebody else's problem. Let Biden deal with it, okay? But the thing is, Seattle is actually like geographically closer to us than Kitimat. You've probably been to Seattle. Have you ever been to Kitimat? Right, okay, so we have this like administrative boundary where we say, no way that I'll pay for that. Somebody else needs to pay for that, but I'm fine paying for this. We take money from our wealthy provinces and we subsidize Atlantic provinces that have no money, right? That haven't generated a lot of revenue in a long time. Okay, this would not be possible without two things. One, it would not be possible without the imposition of violence. In the same way that when you go through, I know we're all like boycotting Tim Hortons, but when we did go through a Tim Hortons drive-thru and they say, do you want to donate $1 to some whatever? Sometimes you say yes, a lot of the time you say no, because it's voluntary. But if you drove up to the Tim Hortons drive-thru and they put a gun to your head, and they said, where's the extra $1, right? That would be the most Surrey thing ever. But they don't do that. But if they did, they collect $1 every time. The imposition of violence makes tax collection possible. Okay, so the first thing is that you need state-sponsored violence. But the other thing that you need is the sense that you and the people of Kitimat belong to one community in some way, shape, or form. We are physically closer to Seattle and we're physically closer to Blaine, Washington, than we are to Castlegar, BC. Right? But we're all bought into a story that we are all equal parts of one Canadian family. Okay? That is a story, and we've bought into it. And it's a story that's conveyed to us through education, and we all have a pretty common idea of what it means to be Canadian. And so, such a world prefers equality because you are all being taxed to deliver services to each other, whether you like it or not. Now, somebody here must be thinking, yeah, but like, clearly people are not actually equal, right? Like, what do you make of indigenous people and slaves when Western nations were ostensibly creating a system based on equality? The United States, in the Constitution, it says all men are created equal. Okay? So when you deal with internal others, and this is one of the, well, actually, I don't want to lose this part. So you want to create a system where you have equal and equitable access to resources, right? And access to services. And an equal and equitable place in the story. The problem, though, is this. When you have people who you clearly do not want to be equal, then something has to give. If you say all men are created equal, and then you say these people can never be more than slaves, then you must also say these people are not human. They are less than human in some way. See, all men are created equal, but those are not men. Those are savages. And this is one of the defects of the equality mechanism in dealing with diversity, in that the imposition of equality means we all need to have one story. We have one story that we're all plugged into because we're all one big happy family. But if they speak French, or they're Catholics, or they're Shia, or they're whatever, right? There's like something that makes them different in the equality matrix, then they are not human. They're something else then. At the very least, they are not us. They are some internal other that we have to keep on the outside. On the other hand, this was not a problem for the vast majority of Ottoman history, because in the system of tolerance, the inhabitants of the Ottoman Empire were not citizens, they were subjects, and the Muslims were subjects too. But the Muslims could be thought of as the preferred subjects. In fact, not just thought of, that's actually what they were called, the preferred millet. So in the millet system, that is a series of nations, you had a bunch of different nations, and the Ottomans, until the 1850s, didn't make the slightest effort in convincing these people that they were one nation. Did not put in the effort to do that. Because it didn't matter. Okay? And of these various nations, the Muslim nation is the preferred one. And by the preferred one, really what that meant is that all public life was in a sense catered to them and to their sensibilities. Expressions of public life, expressions of authority, all of this really reflected a Muslim mode of being. But you did not need to be a member of the preferred millet to access resources and to access services. I'll pause here for a moment and explain why this is important. If somebody comes traveling here from Newfoundland and they get really sick, should they be allowed to go to the hospital in BC, like in Surrey, Vancouver, Burnaby? What do you guys think? Okay, if somebody came to Surrey, actually, when what feels like a lifetime ago, I had a project that I was doing in Prince George, and there was a man in Prince George whose wife had cancer, like one of the people that I was working with, and every few weeks he had to fly into Vancouver for cancer treatment. They didn't have that treatment in Prince George. Do any of you have a problem with that? No? Okay, I didn't think so. So again, would you have a problem if someone was flying in from Seattle? Yeah. What if 100,000 people a month were flying in from Seattle to go to Surrey Memorial Hospital? Do you have a problem with that? Yeah, suddenly you do, right? Okay, you shook your head very enthusiastically. Oh, yeah. No, so that's, okay. So tell me why you would have a problem with that. And this, I'm not making a moral judgment here. I'm just trying to move the conversation along. Why would you have a problem with hundreds of thousands of people from not just Seattle, but let's say Edinburgh, Paris, Berlin? Why would that be a problem?
I feel like it creates like an incentive for people to use the resources of our country, even though they're under the jurisdiction of another country.
Right. The resources of our country, right? Not the Sultan's country, your country, right? Whereas for the people living in the Ottoman Empire, this was the Sultan's realm. Right? They just lived in it. The idea that this belonged to them was inconceivable. Right? You are living under the mercy of the Sultan. And occasionally, the Sultan would need to drag you into some war in a place you've never heard of. And these were not pleasant circumstances. Again, I don't dabble in fantasies. I'm trying to deal with like the reality of the historical record. So, the thing is that in a system of tolerance, where you didn't need to be part of the preferred millet to access services, and services were created by awqaf, yeah, people who didn't belong to the preferred millet used hospitals that were created by Muslims, or used bakeries that were created by Muslims, or used wells that were created by Muslims all the time. It didn't matter. It didn't cross their mind that these people don't own this thing, or that you need to be part of an exclusive group because we all paid tax revenue to make this, because they didn't use it or they didn't create it based on tax revenue. They created it because it was a private trust. It's a whole different world. And it's also a world that didn't require very high levels of state coercion. As far as minorities were concerned, they could represent themselves through their own state institutions. Muslims have a really hard time with this. See, we know with certainty that in Al-Andalus, there were churches, there were synagogues, there were Christians, there were Jews. In the Ottoman Empire, there were huge numbers of Christians and Jews, and they rang their bells in churches, and they wore the cloaks and the clothes of their religion. And then we look around the world now, and we see a place like France where there is a hijab ban. We see a place like Quebec where there are hijab bans in the public service. And what you're actually seeing is the difference in philosophy between tolerance and equality. You're watching it play out right before you, right now. Because in a place like France, they want everyone to be like them. In the Muslim world, that was never considered something that was necessary. When I say never, I mean until the 1850s. I'm going to get to you how all this collapses. It's not like the system of tolerance didn't have any problems. It had a few problems. One problem is, in the system of tolerance, the Ottoman state never bothered to promote a narrative where we are one big giant family. But if you feel like you're on the outside of society, you might be susceptible to other stories where people are telling you that you're part of our family, like the Maronite Christians, who became very close to the French imperial powers, like the Greek Orthodox, who became very close to the Russian imperial powers. And so creating the system that kind of allowed people to just live and let live allowed them to become susceptible to essentially European infiltration. There was a bigger point here, though, is that none of this actually matters when things are good. Okay, so I'm going to do a brief recap. Equality, we tax everyone, we deliver services on a pretty equitable basis, and the only way that people will agree to this is if we use enormous amounts of violence, but we also convince them that we are them, and they are us. Okay, the example that I use with my students is if you were pulled over by the RCMP, you were pulled over by the police, you see a badge, I think it has like a buffalo in it or something, right? And it says RCMP, and then it has the acronym in French or something like that, right? If you got pulled over and the badge said Al-Ajhaz al-Amniya al-Kanadiyya in Arabic, and it had like, I don't know, like a kufiya-clad fighter or something like that on it, how do you think the vast majority of Canadians would feel if that was the police officer who pulled them over? They would feel like they're living under a foreign military occupation. The whole trick of this system is to say, not that the police represent you, they are you, and you are them. That's why they have these like diversity posters with like African American and Japanese Canadian, and you know, like they have all these things to say, we are you and you are us. We're all one big happy family. In the system of tolerance, none of this charade was necessary. But I'm going to go back to what I said, which is that it actually doesn't matter when times are good. So I'm going to use the example of a place I have no particular love for, but that is the United Arab Emirates. So the United Arab, have any of you ever lived in the Emirates? Like you grew up there or something, or born there, or any other of the rentier states? Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi, any of those? Okay, so we got a handful. So those places make it super clear on a regular basis, you are an insignificant nothing and you are not equal, right? They will remind you all the time, you are not equal. So why do people go? Well, they go because they enjoy the lifestyle and the money's good. That's why. Why does a person who is treated as an equal in Scotland go and teach English in Saudi Arabia and live out their entire career there? Again, because they like the lifestyle and the money's good. Okay? Or they can put up with the lifestyle and the money's good. Okay? Maybe they don't love the lifestyle, but the income is good enough. It's a good retirement plan, works for them. How many of them do you think would stick around if the money wasn't so good? Right? As long as things are going well, nobody cares. These aren't tough questions. People will put up with either equality or tolerance. And both have a long history of successes and failures. Abdul Aziz, how am I doing for time? Perfect. I'm almost done. Now, according to the European thinking of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was civilizationally defective. It was broken in two distinct ways. Number one, the Ottoman Empire did not have a state. They did not possess complete control over the use of violence in their peripheries. By the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, basically the French, the British, the Germans, Austro-Hungarians, they had all imposed violence over their peripheral regions. The Russians were a bit slower coming, but the Russians were working very hard on it. The Ottomans hadn't even started. Okay? So the first thing is that they looked at the Ottomans like they were civilizationally defective because they did not bring to their will the unruly fringes of empire. The second way that the Europeans considered the Ottomans to be defective was that they ruled over a multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, and a diverse place. They looked at Ottoman diversity as a defect, as something wrong with them. How can you all living out these contradicting and conflicting stories? A civilized place creates one story and has a homogeneous population. Right? England for the Anglo-Saxons, France for the Franks, Russia for the Rus people. This is the era of nationalism. This is what makes sense, and this was the civilizational standard of Europe. Really built into that second piece, the European kingdoms of the time and the European powers of the time could not stomach the idea that the Muslim Ottomans ruled over Christian populations. They considered that to be like the universe is out of order. This was offensive to their sensibilities. And so these things, the fact that the Ottomans did not have a centralized state and the fact that the Ottomans did not have a single nation, justified constant intervention in the Ottoman Empire. Yes, sir?
What's the problem with having a homogeneous state or having a state where you have one, like Muslims, controlling everybody else around the What's the problem?
Oh, so hold on. Are you asking what's the problem with being diverse or what's the problem with being homogeneous?
Both.
Okay, so you're asking about why are they viewing this as a deficiency? Right? Why are the Europe? Okay, so here's why. Because when you have a state that has imposed its will, and when you have a common story, kind of a single population, that allows you to collect unbelievable levels of taxes. Okay, because you have the compliance of your population. And with those tax revenues, you could build things like transcontinental railways. You can build things like enormous industrialized militaries. You could build things like a modern navy. You could build things like an industrial backbone. You could build all of these things, which admittedly the Ottomans could not do because they didn't have that kind of penetration into their peripheries. Okay? So they're looking at them and saying, look at these monkeys. They can't figure out how to collect their own taxes, and that's why they don't have all these fancy things that we have. Right? Now they've destroyed the planet. But at that time, it all seemed like a very good idea. Okay? So these deficiencies were the justification for intervention, and that brought about, and I'm going to gloss over this and I'll open up time for a nice question and answer. And that brought about something like 4 decades of Ottoman reform. In the 1830s, the Ottomans introduced a reform plan to centralize authority and really impose a state. It didn't work. They tried, but they just weren't there yet. And then, if you want to understand like how porous Ottoman sovereignty was, how easy it was for the European powers to justify intervention in the Ottoman Empire, imagine this. In 1856, a Catholic Palestinian leading a church and an Orthodox Christian Palestinian leading another church got in a feud of some kind. The Russian Empire came to the Ottomans and said, we immediately demand all of your Orthodox Christians fall under our sovereignty. So imagine, there's this like little feud between 2 Palestinian Christians, and the Russian Empire comes and says, based on this feud, we want to have complete sovereignty over your Orthodox Christians. To which the Ottoman Empire said, of course not. And so the Russians invaded Crimea, and that was the Crimean War, and it killed hundreds of thousands of people. Like that. No real sensible justification, but that's where things were at. And in this moment of incredible desperation, the Ottoman Empire was flooded with Ukrainian Muslim refugees, with Balkan Muslim refugees. And this was, even by the definitions of that time, like even looking back on it decades later, this was like a proto-world war. This was enormous. And the British leaned very heavily on the Ottomans to tell them that if only you were to make your system more equal, we wouldn't be so worried about how you treat your Christian populations. Keep in mind, this was at a time when the British put a giant cage around southern Sudan, and they called it the human zoo. So the British were telling the Ottomans, we want you to treat your minorities better, while they are like enslaving people around the world, they are massacring people in the Indian subcontinent. Like, the hypocrisy is, well, it's actually very modern. Like, it's exactly the hypocrisy we see now. And so, in 1856, the Ottoman Empire introduced a civil legal system that legally made Muslims, Christians, and Jews completely equal, abolishing the Sharia. And so, from that point on, the Sharia no longer became a meaningful part of day-to-day life in the Ottoman Empire. They continued to have Sharia courts for inheritance. They continued to have Sharia courts for death and divorce. But otherwise, the Sharia courts really lost their main function. Do you think that stopped European intervention? No. Not even close. Despite all of the promises and all of the assurances, despite the fact that they stopped collecting the jizya, despite the jizya was a tax imposed on non-Muslims, despite the fact that there was no jizya, and despite the fact that they said, hey, now that we're equals, we want Christians and Jews to serve in the military, the Christians and the Jews of Palestine said, absolutely not, we'll pay you a tax instead. How much should the tax be? Guess what? The tax ended up being exactly the same value as the jizya. Now they were just paying it voluntarily. In any case, that brought about, effectively, the end of the Sharia, and you could really say, with some seriousness, that by 1856, the Ottoman state was no longer a caliphate. It was a sultanate. It was a domain of Muslim majority rule, but if somebody wanted to say that the caliphate no longer existed at that point, I wouldn't argue with them. Now, what do I have? 5 minutes? Something like that. I will bring up a few things, because that's not really the end of the story. We are still living out that story. We still look at the contradiction between equality and tolerance as a very real one. We kind of wonder, why do they demand, why would non-Muslims demand that we dress like them? Why would they demand that we speak like them, or that we act like them, or that we have their values, when we don't impose those things in our communities, or we didn't impose those things in our communities? And that's a really difficult thing for many Muslims, even to this very day, to swallow. But one thing that happened is that after this, the less Islamic the empire actually became, the more Islamic it had to pretend it was. So it needed more Islamic symbols. They needed to build more masajid. They needed to make sure, really, it was after the abolition of the Sharia that the Ottoman Sultanate really began pumping the title of Amir al-Mu'mineen for somebody who previously would have been fine just being called the Sultan. The title of the caliphate became amplified precisely as the Sharia degraded. And if you go back to what I said earlier, where did the Ottoman Empire derive its legitimacy from? It wasn't from the imposition of taxes. It was from the delivery of religious services, protecting the Hujjaj, protecting the world's Muslims. And if the Ottoman Empire could no longer do that, people were starting to question, is this Khilafah even legitimate? Is this even a legitimate caliphate? And as soon as they started asking that, the Ottoman Empire realized they had a very serious problem. They had a problem so serious, I did mention this in one of the other talks before, but I will mention it again. This was such a serious problem that the Ottoman Empire went on a mass campaign of promoting the Hanafi madhab. Now, some of you are chuckling because you may have heard this before. And so I will explain why. Of the Islamic schools of the Sunni theology, the Hanafi madhab was the only one that did not insist that the caliph needs to be from the tribe of Quraysh. The Hanbalis, the Shafi'is, and the Malikis, they had ijma'. They were unanimous. Amir al-Mu'mineen should be from Quraysh. Right? So al-Khulafa al-Rashidun, right? The successors to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they were all from Quraysh. The Umayyads were all from Quraysh. The Abbasids were from Quraysh. Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi never claimed to be the caliph. The Mamluks never claimed to be caliphs. They ruled with the Abbasid figurehead. Only the Ottomans took the title of the caliphate without being from Quraysh. But things were really good for a really long time and nobody cared. And when people started caring, they needed people to definitely not question that. I want to end off with a new problem that the Ottomans had that they never had before. Between the 1850s to the 1880s, now the Ottomans have slowly created a modern state. They are able to tax even the Bedouins. They are able to impose their will upon the Bedouins and the peasants and the urban Palestinians. They are able to perform the functions of a modern state. And they have created a society that is legally equal. Mission accomplished. And so now we have a whole new problem. Many of your ancestors from the Indian subcontinent performed Hajj. And when they performed Hajj, like many people who perform Hajj today, they got sick. And when they got sick, they needed to use the hospitals in the Hijaz. Was the Ottoman Empire responsible for flipping the bill to treat these Muslims who are technically British subjects? You see, in decades prior to this, the Ottoman Empire would have said, of course, we are the caliphate of the world's Muslims. Our mandate is to protect the Muslims. But their mandate now was to protect the people that lived in those borders, the subject population who are paying taxes to building these hospitals. Now suddenly, the Muslim who is coming from Morocco, which was outside of Ottoman sovereignty, the Muslim who is coming from Algeria, who's under French sovereignty, the Muslim who is coming from Tunisia, who's under French sovereignty, and the Muslim who is coming from the Indian subcontinent under British sovereignty are foreign subjects. And we still deal with that reality to this very day. when you look at the people of Gaza and you realize that these oil sheiks are staring across a few kilometers away and saying, that's not my problem. That's how we arrive at this. That's how we get there. When they are able to look at something just a few kilometers away and say, that's not our responsibility. We will never, ever stop chasing civilizational goalposts. Once we created a state that had and by we, I mean the Muslims, once we created a system where we had a monopoly on violence, or where the state had a monopoly on violence, once we created a system where all of our subject populations became citizens and they were equal and they could vote, the European powers turned around and told us, but you don't treat your women very good. Now keep in mind, their women weren't treated very good. And so once we did that, they told us, I don't really like how your LGBT laws are. And once we change that, they'll come up with something else because they will never, ever be satisfied with us. And so, stop chasing these civilizational goalposts. It hasn't worked in the past, and it's not going to work in the future. Thank you.
The movie I'm sorry. Okay.
Oh. You should all feel a sense of pity for my former grade 7 students because my social studies classes sound exactly like this. There is no difference. So they had to grow up fast. Yeah.
I'm trying to.
This chair is too high up. I'll sit here. Whew.
We're getting there, guys. 1 second. Okay, all right. So what we try to do is to get one question from the audience. I will also have the anonymous questions online. So we'll get one from the audience, one from...
We could very quickly become unfair. So how did the Ottoman Empire fall so far back behind? How did Europe become so wealthy? Okay, so one person said industrialization, another person said colonialism. Yes, wrong order, right? The colonialism came first. So Europe became so wealthy because they found the Americas, they found the New World, right? And they enslaved the local population, and they also extracted all of its wealth. Why did Europe go looking for the why was Christopher Columbus sailing around the world? Yes?
Because the fall of Constantinople, the Ottoman boxed them in.
Actually, kind of. Like, specifically, what were they trying to do? What were the Spanish trying to do when they sailed around the world? Yes? Find a trade route to India, right? They were trying to find what was wrong with the old trade route to India? It went through the Ottomans. The Ottomans controlled the old route to India. So the Ottomans were not interested in sailing across the Atlantic because they had no need to. They already controlled the existing route to India. It was a bet that nobody thought in the time would have paid off. So if you want me to, if you want to say, what could the Ottomans have done differently? I would say, discover Brazil. That's what the Ottomans, but this is not fair, right? Allah decreed that things would play out the way that they did. But in order to modernize, and on some level, we think of modernization as a positive force, like the way that we use the word in English. Modernity is something good. It has positive connotations. Okay? But modernity requires the state. Modernity requires the imposition of violence. Modernity requires capitalism. It requires these forces. It's not optional. It needs these things. And these are incredibly corrosive forces, like we've discovered as time has gone on, but it needs these things. Well, the Ottoman Empire, in order to do all of these things, needed to subject its own population to unbelievable levels of violence. The real story of the Ottoman Empire is not Arab versus Turk, it's not liberal modernist versus conservative fanatic or something like that. It is a central authority trying to survive and a subject population that does not want its sovereignty violated. And these are two conflicting stories throughout the entire history of the Ottoman Empire. And yet, despite all of this, I should say that the Ottoman Empire viewed itself not as imitating the West. It really didn't. And especially in the time of Sultan Abdul Hamid, they viewed themselves as competing with the West. Most of the secular reforms of the 1850s, 60s, 70s, Sultan Abdul Hamid, I don't want to say he overturned them, but he imposed reignited Islamic identity on the Ottoman Empire. If I were to boil down the grievance of modern Muslims as it relates to the Sharia, the vast majority of the people in this room, myself included, have like this deep of a knowledge of the Sharia, right? Are there any ulama here? And I'm like insulting the people in the... Okay, so like our collective knowledge of the Sharia is super thin. What bothers us more than anything is the madalleh, it's the humiliation. It's the violation of our sovereignty. It's the violation of our will, our irada, what we want. This is the big gripe, right? So do I think the Ottomans could have done something substantially different and still modernize? I'm not sure. And I mean that honestly. These were impossible choices. I do not envy the people who had to make them. Yeah.
So an online question says, well, you're now fourth. I didn't last one. Anyways, are you in favor of reviving an Islamic Sharia to complement state or nation? If so, how do we get there? Jazakallah khair, Ustaz.
Okay. So, do I think that for the Muslims, because keep in mind, things like social norms, okay. In order to answer this question, here's what you have to realize. In the presence of a state, things like awqaf will no longer exist in the long run because the state insists in building everything, right? If any of you are wealthy enough to build a road, you can't. You can't say, look, there's 99A Avenue and there's 99B Avenue, but God, I wish there was a 99C Avenue. You know what? I'm going to do it out of fi sabilillah from my own pocket. I'm going to build a road. You can't, right? Okay. So a waqf, as we understand it, which is public service for the sake of Allah, not really. Okay? What they'll do instead is they'll do like what they did to Jim Pattison. Like, hey, we'll put your name on a hospital, but like you have no say in how it's run or anything like that, right? The state also will erode the sovereignty of the tribe. You can't even hit your kids. Forget like disciplining your tribe with like real violence. Like you can't even like, if you smack your kid in the back, you're gonna go to jail. Like you can't use any force. The only agency that is allowed to use force is the state. Okay. So, let's look at something as I'm going to use like a really obvious, sensational example. Let's look at something like the hijab. As a father living in the system that I described, it's just inconceivable that anyone in your family is going to do something against your will. They need your credibility to survive. Do you know, like, they rely on your nasab. Like, ana fulan ibn fulan. I am so-and-so, the son of the great and honorable so-and-so. Right? They need that to live and to get married and to do everything. But if you go like, oh, my father and I have like a dispute and like, you know, like these kind of, this is not a world that they could have, you needed to obey this person even if he was a tyrant. I'm not telling you that's a great world. I'm just telling you the way the world was. Now realize this. If you take the state system and you do what other reformers in the past have tried to do, which is to say, we're just going to have a nation state and just plug in the Sharia. We're just going to run the Sharia app on this operating system. When people violate the social norms, who will be responsible for imposing those norms? Who will be responsible? The state will be responsible. Okay? So if people are late for salah, who's going to be responsible for making sure they're on time? Right now, if you're late for fajr, it's your mom and dad who wakes you up. Right? Okay? And if you say, I don't want to, they're going to smack you and tell you to get up. Right? Like this is the way that in the previous world, that's how it would have been. So now if you're late for salah and you're just kind of loitering in the street, and this is a bad thing and you want to impose this social norm, who's going to impose this? It's the state. Who's going to impose the hijab? It's going to be the state. Who's going to impose eating with your right hand? It's going to be the state. Does that sound like a place you want to live? Now, I get that for some of you, your knee-jerk reaction is to say yes. The problem is, even the most pious people do not like being told what to do by the state. And the other problem is that the abolition of the tribe and the ascendancy of the state actually allows people to behave reprehensibly without any consequence. Okay, I said earlier that your reputation once upon a time was worth its weight in gold, right? If you're an honest person, you come from a trustworthy family, you can borrow money, you can do things, you can navigate through the world just on the reputation of your family, of your clan, of your tribe, right? If I go into Best Buy right now to buy a TV or to buy a tablet or something like that, do they care if I'm a sack of garbage? Does it matter to them that I'm a lying, reprehensible human? All that matters to them is that my credit is good and that my money's good. As long as my money's not counterfeit and my credit's good, all is well, right? So the state necessarily removes individuals. It frees individuals from the obligation of being good all the time because your reputation no longer matters. Not only that, the state then becomes responsible for administrating all of these social norms, and this sounds like a tough place to live. Now, I don't have a resolution to that problem. We as the Muslims, okay, because we are living in systems that were imposed upon us, in borders that we did not choose. Because of all of that, we have never recovered from the existence of the nation state. We still haven't. And I don't have answers to these questions. So when somebody says, like, would you like the rule of the Sharia? Of course, I would like the word of Allah Azza wa Jal to be upholded to the greatest extent possible. But I also don't like being told what to do. Like, not by my boss, not by police officers, not by any authority. And so again, these are yet to be reconciled problems. Inshallah, somebody smarter than me can solve these problems. I saw somebody's hand. Yes?
Based on the theme of this week, which is Islam, the path to justice. When we talk about Sharia laws, you mentioned that don't like being told what to do.
Yeah.
But generally, it was previously accepted because it was better than the alternative.
Yes.
Is that still the case?
Is being told what to do better than the alternative?
Which is the state-imposed one which we have now.
No, because the state-imposed version is being told what to do. So if I could create my perfect world, I think Muslim cultural values and the urf, the culture. I know we have like a lot, especially when you're in university and you get in these debates in like the multi-faith center. Like, bro, that's culture, that's not Islam. Okay, culture is actually part of the Sharia, like the urf. Okay, culture and customs are part of the Sharia. Islamic cultural norms thrive on strong families, like a strong family unit, not the nuclear family, not mom, dad, son, daughter, grandparents, but strong family units. Much of our Sharia kind of assumes this. So if you're going to start rebuilding things to create a better Muslim community, that's probably a good place to start. I am big on small adjustments that have big impacts as opposed to mass sweeping reformations with no particular goal in sight. I am also not the final authority on this subject. I would love and appreciate and welcome pushback and contestation. But that's where I'm at. So if you can find ways to make small changes in your personal life, this goes a very, very long way. And actually, Gaza is a great example of this. So prior to this genocide, one of the reasons why Gaza has become what it is because a generation of brothers in the 1960s and 70s decided to really socially rebuild Gaza from scratch. Gaza was not a particularly religious place, like as far as Palestine was concerned. This took a Herculean effort. It took a generation. It took a generation of work to create a generation of people who can be victims of a genocide and stare into the camera with a smile and say, Hasbi Allah wa ni'mal wakil. This is not the kind of thing that you build overnight. So, slow and steady. Yeah.
Online question says, do you think it was wrong for European governments to tell the Ottomans to improve the status of women and minorities, given that women had more rights in the West at the time compared to Ottoman areas?
I'm not sure I accept the premise of the question that women had more rights. Women's lives were different. Urban women, this will probably surprise most of the people here. Rural women definitely had, so rural, fallahi, Palestinian women, because that's the world in which I specialize, definitely had more access to work, more freedom to travel, and a greater say in their families than urban Palestinian women or urban European women. That's a hill I'm willing to die on. So in terms of, there was an expectation that they would work. So anyone here from a Fallahi family, from like either a peasant family, not necessarily from Palestine, so you put of like a Fallahi origin. Okay, so let me tell you, my mom's family is from like a Fallahi background. And when my grandmother got married, she had to go through what could only be described as like a dehumanizing obstacle course, where women would sit together, be like, Habibti, Habibti, ta'ali hon. And they'd be like, I brought these nuts with me, but I didn't bring a nutcracker. Can you crack them with your teeth? And this poor girl would sit there cracking these nuts with her teeth, and then her future mother-in-law would be like, ta'ali, ta'ali, and then she'd like comb through her hair and like pull her hair out. And if you're watching this and you don't know what's going on, you think, what are they doing to her, right? And then they do things like, I brought all of this grain with me, but my son didn't come. Could you go and, lift these bags of grain into your granary? And what they were doing is they're trying to see, is this woman physically capable of working? Is she strong? So their beauty standards, they weren't looking for this like super, like the jawline and her beautiful pointed nose. They're trying to see, can she do farm work? Because the women were expected to participate in the collective work. Urban Palestinian women, a very different life. Now, with that said, so that's why I reject the premise of the question, that European women somehow had it better. And do I think their intervention was unjust? Of course I do. Of course I think that it was unjust. The question that we started with, though, is what could the Ottomans do about it? What could they have done about this? And everything, I'm at the point now where I could say they did just about everything they could have done. It's just difficult for us to imagine the scale of the conspiracy that they were facing. Every reform that the Ottomans were doing, they were doing under the barrel of a gun. Well, really, 4 or 5 guns. One from the British, one from the Russians, from the Austro-Hungarians, from the French, from the Italians, from the Americans. Eventually, right, from the Americans. They were constantly operating under this pressure. A very difficult circumstance. But yeah, the premise of the question I found somewhat problematic. Any, Omar, you've had your hand up for a while, and then I'll take a question from you, sir.
You don't necessarily have to impose, like, for me to be able to control someone, I don't have to impose violence on them. I could control them by media, by education. What you see, for example, today is people are copying each other based off of the social media. So I can control that aspect of it because like, let's say, I don't know, let's say politicians.
Mm-hmm.
Politicians, when they have a political campaign, they need money for it, right? So politicians that don't need the money and can fund it themselves typically have more say in how they can rule a country. But for example, if I have a politician that needs donors, those donors can use those politicians as a vessel for their own benefit, for their own self-interest.
The Holy Land Foundation. Have you ever heard of it? Prior to Islamic Relief was the biggest Islamic charity in North America. And it was responsible for, again, until Islamic Relief, there was just nothing in the world that compared to the scale of the Holy Land Foundation. Okay? So in terms of the money that was flowing through the organization, enormous. In terms of the leverage that they had, huge. Right? So we're talking about a major organization doing major work with major money. Okay? In 2002, the Bush administration, through their anti-terrorism laws, came in, shut the Holy Land Foundation down, gave all its founding members life sentences. Without the tools of violence. Like, could you start a bank? You know, a group of our Somali brothers decided, this was it was before I was married, so maybe 15 years ago. A group of our Somali brothers decided, why are we using Western Union for remittance payments? This kafir organization that charges interest and is totally against our principles, right? Of course, as many of you, I hope, would know, Somalis send a lot of money to their relatives overseas, right? Big community here, a lot of people in need over there, it makes sense. Okay? They could not. They would not grant them, the state would not grant them the rights to create another thing like Western Union. They'll allow you to create something with your own name, but it goes through Western Union. They'll allow you to create something with your own name, but it goes through TD Bank, but they won't let you create your own bank. And you say, no, I've got millions of dollars. So it doesn't matter. So you go ahead and do it anyway. Okay? They will arrest you for money laundering. And then you say, I'm not money laundering. And they say, yes, you are, and you're going to defend it in court. And you're going to say, I don't recognize this court. Then they will send men and women of violence to come shut you down. Okay? All of these things, ultimately, I take the point in that violence is not the only thing. That is true. Violence is the foundational thing. It's not the only thing. You are right. It's the foundational thing that allows every other state apparatus to function. And private enterprises on some level. Sure. Well, he had his hand up, so I'll take this question and then go online. Yes. Yeah, come.
Some would argue that there was no khilafah after the khilafah of Al-Hasan ibn Ali, since the principle of Ashura was disabled.
Yes.
And they say that it became mulk Ali. And the proponents of that opinion, at that time, some of them escaped to Yemen and Oman, and they started making some revolutions. Others would argue that there was a khilafah since those delivering the Islamic services to the Muslims, and since they kept the guardianship of Islam. So, do you have kind of personal opinion about it in this argument between both?
I think the narrative. So he's saying that some have argued that there was no khilafah after Al-Hasan radiallahu an decided to step down and give the khilafah to Muawiyah. Okay. That's a very compelling argument. It's a very compelling argument that really after that we were just dealing with monarchies. Some were more righteous than others, okay, but we were basically just dealing with monarchies. However, at the same time, we recognize that there is something fundamentally different about the post-Sykes-Picot world, right? Like, so sure, there was Khilafah Rashida, and then there was a period of kingship, some righteous, some not so righteous, some tyrants and some good kings. But are Sultan Abdul Hamid and Muhammad bin Salman the same thing? No. Right? Like there is something, so I'm willing to say, Hai mish khilafah, hai mish khilafah. Like I'm willing to, I'll go down there with you, right? But they are not the same. On some level, there's something fundamentally different about Sultan Abdul Hamid and Sultan Abdul Majid, like before him, okay? And comparing them to Muhammad bin Zayed and Muhammad bin Salman. Something is different about these people. So if we want to come up with a third category to say what type of dystopian nightmare we're in now, I'm willing to concede that. There's not a hill I'm willing to die on.
Online question says, if Muslims were the preferred group, is it fair to call the caliphate a Muslim supremacist government and society? Is it also fair calling it a colonial power that practiced slavery?
No, I like this. Is it fair to call it a Muslim supremacist? I'm actually going to take this as a good faith question at face value. My inclination would be no, because the Ottoman Empire made no effort to impose Muslim values on the private lives of Christians and Jews. There was no effort to be made on them in that regard. So, if we think of France as a fundamentally racist state, I don't know how many people would argue with that, but maybe somebody will, and I don't think they would, but I'll use France as an example. Israel is another great example of that. If we think of them as fundamentally racist states, their desire to impose their will in the homes and in the minds of their populations is unlike anything that would have been experienced in the Ottoman Empire. If you're going to say that, well, no, supremacy just means to give one group an advantage over others, yeah, okay, fine. But the Ottoman Empire also did not really operate a state where those resources that states use would have really propped up these groups. A lot of this you're talking about numbers, right? Now the second part of the question is on slavery, and the reality is, yes, the Ottoman Empire definitely had slaves. Right through to the end, not exactly. And slavery definitely meant something different in the Ottoman Empire than what it meant in North America, or in the Americas in general. So if I'm going to talk about this subject, I'll mention a few things. Probably the most infamous example of slavery in the Ottoman Empire were the Devshirme, something like that. I always read the word, I never actually say it. So the story goes like this. The Ottoman Empire never did this to Christians and Jews in the Arabian Peninsula, but apparently they did this quite a bit in the Balkans, where the Ottoman Empire would go into the Balkans, would go into places inhabited by like Serbs and Croats and these populations, and they would basically take their children. And they would take their children and they would give them the best education that they had available, and they would make them into either super elite soldiers or into government ministers. Okay? Now, if I'm going to be honest, this to me sounds like a residential school on steroids, right? Like you're taking, because they were giving them a better life, but I have 2 kids. Like, I would not like this. And not only that, but I think you'd have a very difficult time making the case that this was a Sharia compliant thing to do. Okay? I'm not here to be an Ottoman evangelist, right? I'm here to just tell the truth of what the historical record says. But also very interestingly is that in Bulgarian, what do they call them when you sing stories to your lullabies? In Bulgarian lullabies, there are Bulgarian lullabies that basically say, I don't know the words because I don't speak Bulgarian, but it ends off with, and if you're lucky, a nice pasha will come and take you away. Now what's interesting about that is because there is a lot of contestation over how resentful the Christian populations actually were over this. Okay? When some of those Christians converted to Islam, in mass, they converted to Islam on the condition, so Bosnian Muslims became Muslim on the condition that their children would be recruited as janissaries. We will become Muslims, but don't stop taking our kids. Now, when I read that, it surprised me. You could read it in the work of historian Karen Barkley. She's done a lot of work on this. But, and I know MSA bros, right? Some of you are thinking, yes, I can't wait to use this in my next debate. Somebody's going to bring this up in my lecture. I'm going to smash him over the head with it. Actually, they loved it. No, like in reality, the truth is never black and white. I bet there were some parents who were devastated to have their children taken away. And the historical record is also clear that there were some parents who felt that they could not give their children possibly a better life. One of the most amazing stories, and I can't remember the names, and I wish I was prepared for this question, was there was a Grand Wazir. Grand Wazir was equivalent to the Prime Minister. Grand Wazir, who was one of these Devshirm, who was the brother of the head of the